Welcome back to the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. Detroit, like many parts of the country, is facing a housing crisis. Over half of renters in the city are cost-burdened, spending more than 30% of their income on housing. Meanwhile, the number of homeless children in Detroit reached a record high last year, with 455 kids experiencing homelessness on a single day. In her new book, And Housing for All, The Fight to End Homelessness in America, Maria Foscarinis says homelessness is the outcome of calculated political choices. She says these decisions have entrenched poverty and made stable housing unattainable. Foscarinis is an attorney and advocate who's spent decades fighting for housing justice. So what will it take to shift America's approach to housing, to treat it as a human right? To answer this question, Maria Foscarinis joins us now. Maria, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Robin. It's great to be with you.
So, Maria, your book starts by asserting that homelessness is a choice that our society has made, not a personal failure of those who experience it. Could you briefly explain how we arrived at this point where, as we speak, historic numbers of people are homeless or housing insecure?
Well, so homelessness did not always exist to the extent that it does today. But it used to be that our country funded housing for people who needed it, for people who were poor, made sure that there was enough affordable housing. Housing programs put in place during the New Deal after the Great Depression threw millions of people into homelessness, supported people who were poor and made sure that they were able to afford housing. These funds were cut drastically starting in the early 1980s when Ronald Reagan came into office on a promise to shrink the federal government. So that's really when the crisis of mass homelessness as we know it today really started.
So you see the impact of President Reagan's policies as a real tipping point when it comes to the housing crisis in America.
That's right. That is when housing funding was slashed. Right now, only 1 in 4 of people who are poor enough to qualify for housing assistance from the government actually receives it. 1 in 4. That number is about to become much larger should the current proposals before Congress become law. But right now, that's a very small fraction of people are getting the help they need. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to repeat you one more time in saying 1 in 4 people who qualify for housing are getting it. And that just sounds quite stunning.
It is. It is stunning. This is the legacy of those cuts that started in the early 1980s. And, you know, it used to be that just about everyone who was poor enough to qualify could get help. That has not been the case for 40 years. And so, you know, people tend to think that, well, yes, we have the social safety net, but we really don't. Certainly not when it comes to housing. These trends have all been exacerbated by what's been going on in the private market. So housing costs have really skyrocketed. I think everybody experiences this, or most people experience this. 60% of people are now living paycheck to paycheck, and that's because costs are going up and incomes are not. So these are big trends, and what we see in homelessness is kind of the visible tip of a much bigger problem.
I want to get into some of your advocacy work, but before we do that, something that I've heard from a lot of housing advocates and people fighting against homelessness is that one of the really important things that needs to happen is that there needs to be a change in the way that we talk about homelessness, that the conversation needs to shift to understanding that one of the root causes is a lack of affordable housing, which you've been discussing with us so far. Do you think that the conversation is changing in that way?
I do. I do think there's a much greater recognition now than when I first started, for example, that housing is the driving force behind homelessness, that these are inextricably linked. So I think people are understanding this, and I think also as more and more people are affected by the affordable housing crisis, they are seeing this much more clearly.
Now, Maria, your advocacy, it began early with creating the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. What was this law intended to achieve, and why didn't it solve homelessness?
It was never intended to solve homelessness. So the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act was actually just part one of a three-part proposal. The three-part proposal included emergency relief, preventive measures, and long-term solutions. Only part one got enacted. That was the emergency relief part. That's what became the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. So that funded primarily emergency shelter. And we all know, and we knew at the time, that emergency shelter is not the solution to homelessness. It's a stopgap, it's a
Right.
band-aid at best. To really solve homelessness, you need housing. And I talked about the housing cuts. Those cuts have never been restored. So that's why, the McKinney-Vento Act, that helped a lot of people. Certainly it helps people to offer any kind of aid, but it's not going to solve the problem without the housing.
So what you're saying is that the U.S. remains in a reactive mode versus a proactive mode when it comes to trying to support folks and address some of the reasons that people are falling into homelessness and housing insecurity.
Exactly. I think that's exactly right.
I want to stay on the topic of your advocacy work for a moment. You went on to form what is now known as the National Homelessness Law Center to further address homelessness through the law, through policy. And in your book, you share personal stories like your Uncle Nico's execution during World War II for resisting oppression. I'm wondering, Maria, how did your family's history shape your values and fuel your advocacy for ending homelessness?
Well, I share that story to share that I don't have a personal connection to homelessness in the sense of having experienced it myself, but I certainly grew up with these stories of hardship and the sense that human beings do things to other human beings that they don't have to do, and that it's possible to fight back. So I grew up with a sense of justice and injustice and a feeling that, yeah, I have an obligation to do something in my world that to stand up for what's right and to fight injustice. So that's why I share that story. And I think many people can look in their own lives and see a connection to a sense of, what's right, what's wrong, how do we show up in the world to address the injustices that we see around us. So I find it enraging, actually, that we live in a country that has so much wealth and so much, but there's then that there are people that have nothing, that we can allow our society to to have people not have the basics they need to survive, while others have so much more than they could possibly ever use.
Maria, it reminds me of a conversation that I had with a director of a homeless shelter. This was back in Colorado, and he happened to be a former history professor. And he said, I hope we will look back at ourselves at this moment in time when we allowed people to live on the streets and we walked past them as if everything was normal. I hope we will be astounded by ourselves.
Yes, exactly. That's very well put. It is astounding. It is astounding, and we need to be shocked every time we do that.
You know what that also brings to mind for me as we talk about justice and injustice and normalizing this very abnormal problem that affects people so deeply. I'm thinking about how cities have laws on the books that punish folks for being homeless, like making it illegal to sleep outside. In your eyes, why are these laws so harmful?
Well, these are also shocking laws. So people are on the street because they have no other place to be. And instead of helping them, many cities and states are actually punishing them criminally. And for one thing, it's terribly cruel and just inhumane. But for another thing, it's counterproductive. If you criminally punish someone, if they end up with an arrest record, that just makes it even harder for them to find a job, to find housing, sometimes even to get into shelter, to get out of the situation that they're in, that you are punishing them for. So it's terribly ineffective and counterproductive. People are forced off the street in what are known as sweeps,
Right.
where police come through and forcibly remove people. Often they lose their possessions. They might lose their ID, their documents, things that they need to try to get out of homelessness. So it's a terrible cycle, and it's also expensive. This costs resources, police resources, court resources, city resources of all kinds. So it's a waste of money that just makes everything worse.
And yet, though, Maria, the other side of the coin might be a business owner who says, there are folks experiencing homelessness who have essentially set up a tent in front of my business, and it has impaired my business. It's stopped folks from walking through my doors. What do you say to those folks?
Of course, no one wants people to be sleeping on the street. I think those are legitimate concerns. The question is, what do you do about them? I think that business owner could certainly understand that it makes no sense to just force people to move to another corner, to just make it harder for them to get out of their situation. I think that person, that business owner, really needs to use their voice to put pressure on government to pursue solutions that we know work. And those solutions revolve around housing.
We're talking about homelessness and how to solve it. Our guest is attorney, advocate, and author Maria Foscarinis. Her new book is "And Housing for All: The Fight to End Homelessness in America." Maria, we're going to get into some of your solutions here in a moment. I thought it was important that we laid out a few of the problems and the history. And before we get into those solutions, though, I mentioned at the top that many Detroit kids are facing homelessness, but the numbers are likely an underestimate of the true problem. What are some things people are unaware of when talking about kids who are experiencing homelessness? What are the invisible hurdles they face?
So kids experiencing homelessness face a whole host of problems and challenges. One key issue is going to school. Children need to go to school. School can provide stability, continuity, and that's especially important for kids who are homeless to have that. It can also be a source of food through school lunch and breakfast programs, even basic health care through school nurses. So going to school is really essential, and it's also essential that kids get an education if they're going to have any hope to have a better future. There are a lot of barriers to going to school for homeless children. Chief among them, transportation, sometimes also residency requirements, documents that their parents need to produce so that they can enroll in school. This is something that original law we talked about, the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, addresses.
Right.
And it requires that schools remove those barriers. It's made a difference. I think this has been an aspect of the law that has made a difference, but it's not often fully enforced. It's been enforced often thanks to litigation, but it has, and it's also very poorly funded. This is a program that needs funding, and it does not get enough of it.
But what you're saying is schools can be a true anchoring force for kids experiencing homelessness. But then there is the question of whether they're even able to attend school. I do want to get into some of the solutions that you suggest in your book. You reference Finland's success with the housing first model. And this model is central to how you think the U.S. could address homelessness. Could you explain briefly how this model differs from what we typically see in the U.S.?
Well, so the U.S. has theoretically adopted the housing first model. That is official federal policy. Housing first says, first we offer housing, and then if the person needs other services like mental health or substance abuse care, then we bring that in. But housing is the key. You need that foundation. The problem is, for housing first to work, you need the housing. So there's not enough affordable housing. We get back to that. In Finland, housing first is seeing a lot of success because the country invests in housing. There is sufficient affordable housing for this model to work. So even though housing first was actually is an American model, it was first spearheaded here in the United States. We don't fund it. This is the fundamental problem. So you set up a program to fail. It's a model that can have a lot of success, but it needs to be funded at the scale to make a difference.
But Finland is a much smaller country. It's of course more culturally similar. How do you change hearts and minds when it comes to prioritizing housing in this way and funding a housing first model sufficiently?
Well, I'm not sure that the size of the country really matters. Yes, Finland is a much smaller country. It's also a country that doesn't have the enormous resources that the United States has. So I think it is a matter of mindset and culture. I think we have this mindset here, and again, I go back to Reagan, that it's your own fault if you're homeless or if you're poor. We need to embrace a different mindset that says we're all human, we all have needs, and we all might fall on hard times. And we have to build a society that creates a safety net that can really help people in time of need, and that is also fair. It's not just in times of need, it has to be fair. Right now, the majority of people in this country are struggling to afford the basics that they need. And so that points to a society that is deeply unfair. We know that there is enormous inequality in our country. There's enormous income and wealth inequality. We need to do something about this. Homelessness is the tip of that.
Maria, I'm losing you a little bit. It sounds like you're going underwater. I'm hoping to bring you back.
I'm sorry.
No worries.
Is that better?
That's a little better. Some American cities, including Seattle and Kansas City, now view housing as a human right. What practical actions are these cities taking, and how could similar initiatives take shape and help a city, let's say, like Detroit?
So Seattle has just in the past few years created a city agency to develop social housing. Social housing is housing that is permanently affordable to people, including people with very low incomes. And they just passed by referendum funding. This was an initiative that passed with almost 60% of the vote to fund this model. So that is something that I think cities can do, and there are a number of other cities who are going down this road, and there's no reason why Detroit can't explore this model and begin working towards that. So the idea is cities develop their own social housing and put resources into that. I think that's a way to take action, especially now when the likelihood of federal support is dimming.
Thank you for helping us to re-envision what the future can look like. Maria Foscarinis, her new book is "And Housing for All, The Fight to End Homelessness in America." Maria, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you very much, Robin. Appreciate it.
Coming up on the Metro, a number of universities in Michigan are collaborating to protect federal funding under a rebranded group. We'll hear more about that next. Stay with us.